Welcome, everybody. My name is Dave Bailey. I want to thank you for joining us. This is Grief and Grace. Like most people, I've had my own deep personal experience with grief, and in my work with the largest provider of funeral services in North America, I spend time with grieving families on a daily basis. And so out of that awareness, this Facebook Live was created to be one of the spaces, one of the voices helping to process a little bit of that common human experience. My guest tonight is Dr. Tashel Bordere, who's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Human Development and Family Science at the University of Missouri, with a research specialty in the area of dying, loss, and bereavement issues, particularly in respect to African American children, youth, and families. And if you know someone that you think could benefit from the ideas that we're going to be talking about here tonight, why don't you go ahead and tag them in the comments so that they get a notification. They can come join us. And also, if you have a question during the show, just put it in the comments, and we'll take some time to answer as many of those as we can before we sign off. All right, Dr. Bordere, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here, David.
It is so good to have you. We've been trying to put this together for quite a little while, and I'm just totally excited that we were finally able to make this happen and that you're here as our guest tonight. So let me start with this. Tell us a little bit about what you do and the research that you're involved with and your focus on grief and loss in the African American community.
Okay. So my research focuses primarily on adjustment to loss within social, many different contexts. My focus is on Black youth and families, and the kind of the historical and contemporary coping mechanisms that have been used as they've dealt with a variety of types of death and non-death losses, particularly the more stigmatized ones like homicide and sudden death, which have kind of been hallmarks of the African American experience for a century, for a long period of time now.
Yes. And how long have you been involved in that research?
Whoa, this will age me. I feel like I'm getting older now. I would say since a graduate student. So I don't know, maybe that's like 20 years, I'm guessing.
Wow.
Something like that. Yes.
And the University of Missouri has created a place for that research to have a home.
Oh yes, absolutely. I'm probably known as the death lady on campus.
That's funny.
And also in the community.
Yes.
But in terms of hope, we can talk to her, we can trust her. This is a safe space. And so I'm frequently called upon to do things and collaborate. And so that's a great experience.
Yeah.
Really, in terms of increasing people's awareness of loss in a lot of different other areas, other disciplines.
Yes. Well, what I want to do tonight is I want to ask you some questions, and then I want to get out of the way because I want to give you an opportunity to help us. I feel like this is a time when there's a cultural awareness of grief, a social awareness of grief across the board because of the global pandemic and all of that loss. But then that's also played in to a historic voice of grief from the African American community. There's like this psychic pain, this and I just am so thankful that you're here, that we're able to have this timely conversation, and I just really want your voice to be front and center, and for you to help us walk through some of this understanding. So let me start with this. In your research, you talk about how African American youth and families are uniquely bereaved by disparagingly high rates of premature death due to gun violence, and that they are also disproportionately bereaved by multiple losses because of individual and institutional discrimination and oppression, where Black lives and deaths do not seem to matter. And because of that, there are profound disparities that exist in death rates and health outcomes and grief experiences in the African American community. And I know that's a lot, but
Yeah.
could you just unpack that for us a little bit?
Sure. So, well, where to begin? That is a lot. That is a lot, David. I want to just say that we see some of these things kind of manifesting. So my area, again, what's intriguing and really challenging is that the youth, the college students, the teenagers who I've studied and done interviews with. I'm a qualitative researcher where I look a lot at lived experiences and survival within those experiences.
Yes.
And what we find in my work and in the works of a lot of other scholars, several other scholars in this area, I won't say a lot, several, is that there are these other intersecting losses. So a young adult college student who's African American will have experienced the death of a homicide, but then there are also these other deaths that are happening, in conjunction with those, like the death of a grandparent, the death of a great grandparent, due to some type of often healthcare disparity, right? Which we're
Yes.
seeing with COVID right now. Some pre-existing condition that was preventable, like diabetes,
Yes.
or some other chronic illness that it impacts their quality of life either way. So youth in particular. So if you want to think of, and I'm a developmentalist, so I always am thinking of things along, people's experiences along the lifespan, right? And so you have children, very young children, who are very likely, African American kids who are likely to be dealing with, being exposed to some type of violence. It doesn't matter the socioeconomic status. We'll be more likely to see this occurring in, lower income areas with less social capital, resources, counseling services, healthcare services that are accessible. But we also see this, we see them grappling with this throughout their development.
Yes.
I'm in this area of study because as a young child, I heard my grandmother say, and she meant well. I think my siblings were kind of acting, I don't know, being very busy, I would say. And she basically said, you'll be the death of your mother. And it's like, oh my goodness, like who would be thinking about that, like stayed with me throughout my development, right? So I guess I say that to say that there's this looming idea that something might happen to somebody that I care about, and that has special significance in the Black community because, again, across development, there will be these concerns about when I need help, when I need care, I may not be able to get it, right? So there's a lot of mistrust. So as you move throughout development, from a young child to an aging person, all of these resources that should be available, and I don't even want to make a comparison, they just plain and simply should be available and accessible. So they're available, but they're not within reach, right?
Yes.
So you have people across development who realize that, wow, this thing happened, but we have to be self-reliant. I can't rely on necessarily law enforcement, and I'm not trying to rule out everybody. There are some great folks out there, not enough in some cases. And then healthcare too, there's just a lack of understanding, and a lot of really discriminatory things, I can't phrase this any other way, that continue to happen, such as people's belief that Black people don't feel pain the same, so they're less
Yes. likely
likely to be given medication. Even young children with appendicitis, we've seen in research, Black kids are less likely to be given pain medicine in an emergency room. So when you're thinking about all of these things, I can't count on this group to help me. I can't really rely on healthcare. I can't trust them that they're going to give my person the medicine that they need. And I don't know if I can really even call the police, because as we just saw more recently with Jacob Blake, he was, I guess, we don't know all of the details, but in any case, there was a call for help, and he ended up being shot and is now paralyzed 7 times, right? And so all of those kind of institutional systems that exist but are not, serving the focus role, serving the helping role that they're supposed to, are not there. So when you experience the death of a neighbor who you counted on in the Black community, or a family member who was like the matriarch or patriarch or whatever the case was, and they died, then it's an even more significant loss in the absence of these other layers of support that we might find in communities who have more privileges economically, socially, politically, and things of that nature.
Wow.
So there's always the threat.
Yes.
And that in and of itself is a loss, right? There's always the threat of it. I have personally started taking pictures of all of the different places that where, that I go to, just even to a bookstore or a, clothing store, where I'm followed around. I've literally now just started taking pictures as I watch people refix books that didn't need to be readjusted, or move around clothes on a rack where they don't really need to be moved, simply because they're trying to follow me around to make sure I'm not stealing. So these like everyday microaggressions and experiences are really tough. And then when, and these are just these extra things that are going on in addition to, these are the losses that might be imminent.
Yes.
And that we're really seeing most clearly through COVID. In the midst of the pandemic, we're still seeing violence between people who look like each other, as well as between people who, law enforcement and people of color,
Yes.
not just Black, but Latino as well.
Yeah,
Male.
it's interesting. I was, reading Ibram X. Kendi's book. I can't remember the name of the book, but anyway, it's the whole history, and
Yes.
I just began to contemplate. So many of us will say and believe, I'm not racist. I've got a black friend, or my best friend is black, whatever. And I began to contemplate that there's a lot of isms that happen, and those isms are essentially a set of preconceived notions, a set of beliefs. So that racism is a set of beliefs or notions or ideas or whatever about a certain race or class of people. And so in the same way that sexism is, the same way that classism is, the same. And until we are able to examine those preconceived notions, until we actually want to take those preconceived notions out, until we stop with the they and them and this whole sense of, this monolithic, the black, whatever it might be, and people become people, and we start to drop. And it's hard, I mean, I chuckle at people who say to me, I'm not racist. And I'm like, really? Because I don't think it's possible not to be racist. I think it's possible to be anti-racist and to work every day to examine my racist preconceived notions. But unless I'm willing to do that, those notions come up. So you walk into a bookstore and this preconceived notion rises up that she might be dangerous, she might be a thief, it's it's a hard place. So this is a historic time in our nation, and it's like there's a breathtaking mix of generational sorrow and suppressed rage and hope for some tangible change, and it's playing out on our TV screens on a daily basis. So let me ask you this question. What is the relationship between grief in the African American community and the desire or the demand for social change and social justice?
The grief around it would be the notion that it's still something that is being sought out. Part of the grief is explaining and re-explaining and just watching the same events like replay out in a different geographic space, right? Whether it's California or New York or Baton Rouge, wherever the case is, right? Wherever it's at, Wisconsin. So the grief is around just this feeling of just the fatigue, the anger. The grief would be the anger, the sadness, the kind of the stress around watching these same events play out within a broader system that really is designed to keep power in a specific place, right, in the hands of certain entities. And so it's really challenging to, actually what's interesting is that there will be this cycle of, I've written about like despair and hope, right? There's this constant like cycle of despair and hope that which I think is a major strength for Black communities, by the way, right? This notion of, unfortunately, long suffering.
Yes.
And being faced with the same experience despite conversation around it, despite protest around it. The expectation that after prior to George Floyd, right, there was Emmett Till, and then we've
Yes.
gone all of the deaths, and there were deaths before Emmett Till, right, but that one was the most visible, right, on purpose. But moving through each one of these losses, and the idea that they're continuing despite various protests, really is taxing. It's emotionally taxing. It's physically taxing, and it's really difficult. It's difficult to deal with. It's difficult to go to work with these things going on. It's difficult to parent, to occupy all of the different roles that are necessary to carry out on a daily basis when these things just keep happening over and over without any regard for justice in some ways. Now, I also want to couple that with the idea that we are seeing more allies. I do think that more people are getting it, and it takes a while to see the change you want to see in people, right? And this is in a lot of different groups, LGBTQ, people who have, people who, different populations that we're less familiar with.
Yes.
It takes time to be able to figure out, to understand, to open our minds up to understand these different populations and their plight. But it is more hopeful that we're seeing visibly more examples of, momentum. Throughout history, allies have always been important, yes, right? And whatever the group is of marginalization, allies have always been important. They always occupy a significant role. Harriet Tubman, right, had allies with the Underground Railroad. At my job, it's central for me to have an ally who can speak on my behalf when people might not understand my experience, even with their best hope, they may not just get it, right? So having an ally who can validate this experience is really important. And so we're seeing more of that, and we're seeing it with different athletic teams and things of that nature. Yes. So the grief is just around just this cycle of continually having to re-explain to people who may not get it and who may not hope to get it. Some people are not going just choose to not get it simply because they see it as it in their minds threatens the power that they've been able to walk with in this world.
Yes.
Right? The political power, the financial power, the healthcare power and access. And so when that gets threatened, it's scary. The deal is there is enough. There is enough for everybody. I think what people may not understand that is very important is that when power cannot be shared, when power is not shared and access to resources is not shared, the whole society still pays a cost.
Yes.
Society will pay a cost. Again, I study homicide laws, and it's very expensive. When we don't ensure that books are in educational systems, right? When they don't have access to books or teachers who are not burnt out from all of the hard work that they're doing in these stressful environments. When we don't provide these things, then kids get marginalized. And then we're more likely to see violence. We're more likely to see externalizing behaviors. More deaths. It's very expensive for a person to be shot and go through the hospital system. Yes. Everybody's paying for that. And so, we can help people reach their goals, make sure that everybody's having these access to these tools, or people will pay either way.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So I see a comment, and it's a good comment, just a quick comment said on both sides. Sure. And I think that is the point, that all of us have to be aware that we all carry sets of assumptions.
Yes.
Whether, I might carry a set of assumptions about Latino people or Black people or these new immigrants or this Korean man who's been here for 25 years and didn't learn to speak English, and I have a whole set of assumptions about that and whatever. And they may have a whole set of assumptions about me, about the way that I feel about them, etc. Racism knows no boundaries. It infects the human experience, and the challenge of overcoming that or being anti-racist, of just being serious about examining those assumptions on a daily basis. So,
but if I might say something about that, though, and this is something else. The only way that a person can discriminate, though, is that you have to have the power to do that.
True.
And that is an important distinction.
Yep.
When we're looking at racism and things like that. And I don't want this to just be a we-they conversation, and that's not where I'm going. I appreciate that you're also trying to help people broaden just ideas and understanding of things. But the bottom line is, you can only really be racist. I mean, you might have, there is a very justifiable and legitimate hypervigilance that people who are underrepresented walk around with for their safety.
Thank you. Could you say that again? Say that again. I think that's important to say.
There is a certain level of, and I would try my best, of hypervigilance, and it's just part of racial trauma, quite frankly. People who have been traumatized because of the violence we're watching on television, maybe the violence in their communities, being followed around in a store. I'm a college professor who's a researcher, and I'm internationally, and I get followed around in a store. Yep. So, the deal is, if hypervigilance, this additional worry, is justifiable based on the human experience.
Yes.
People are not just born being concerned about populations. You learn that based on your experience.
Yes.
I learned that when I watch somebody grab their purse on an elevator like I'm going to rob it. Like it's the most. I feel like I'm the most smiley. Like all these kind of, and to that whole notion that if somebody could be afraid of me, but beyond the knowledge that I possess, it's concerning, right? So I'm always keenly aware of things that I wish I didn't have to be aware of. Walking my dog at night in my neighborhood, I just won't do it because I don't feel safe in a predominantly white neighborhood.
Yes.
So that's insane, right? So the bottom line is, there is a justifiable hypervigilance. It doesn't mean that, but that does not mean that Black people, to discriminate, you have to have political power, you have to have social power.
Wow.
So if you don't have that to the same extent, when I go to a store, for example, to complain, if I were to complain about something, the chances of me seeing somebody who looks like me will be slim. And already there is already, I know that there will be some level of being confronted with some stereotypes about, am I just an angry Black woman?
Yep.
Right? So these kinds of things you don't hope for, right? You don't hope for them, but there is a possibility, because we do live in a race conscious, sex conscious, sexuality conscious. We do live in a culture where that prevails, and so it's a sense of relief when you don't deal with that.
Yes.
Does that make sense? You don't.
Totally. So, how do we have the conversation then? How do we have the conversation? How does someone who has power, who has the ability to discriminate, who has the option to discriminate, and who is pretty comfortable with their stereotypes, how do they begin, or how does someone begin a conversation with them that builds a bridge? Like, is it possible to bridge that gap somehow?
I have to believe yes, David. And I hope that the listeners are feeling like that too. Now, here's the deal. So we're having the tough conversation right now, right? And so we have to acknowledge what happened. The first step toward any change is being able to say, these things are going on.
Yes.
And whether or not we are intentionally participating in them or not, they're happening. It's just what it is. It's grounded in, it's found in research, right? We know it. And so I've done a lot of work around trying to help foster conversations, to help foster alliance building, and to help foster self-awareness, because part of it is the self-awareness, right? If we walk around and we, are telling people just be happy, but they're living in a world that's discriminatory, like that's really challenging. It's offensive to do that. It's to minimize their experience. And so part of the change that needs to happen requires of each individual really to be aware of ourselves, of our words, of the jokes we tell, of our ability to believe a person when they said they've had an experience.
Yes.
Right? Just simply
talk about that. Talk about that a little bit, because
sure.
Across the board, with grief. We tend to want to tell people what their grief experience should be. We tend to
Yeah.
want
My
to tell
goodness.
people when they should be better, when they should stop grieving this. And white people want to tell black people what their experience of grief should be and how they
Yes.
should process that grief, as if we knew. So
Yes.
talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. And I always try to prefer not to say everybody, but I appreciate do you self-identify as a white male?
I do.
Okay, so I'm just highlighting that. So
Yep.
before I say, I always ask the question because we don't know, right?
Yep.
And so yeah, so I appreciate as a white male you having this conversation. I think that speaks volumes, and it speaks to your courage too, because you could have this is an alliance building effort right here, right? Your ability to say, let's talk about this and let's figure out how we can navigate this space. Otherwise, we pay either way when people's mental health care suffers or health care suffers. So this is a healing space you've created. So thank you. Some of the ways that we might be able to have the conversation, and I just got caught up because I'm caught up in this moment of just even having this interview together.
Yes.
Right? You see far more women in this, so I appreciate that. I just need to say that again. So we were talking about having the conversation, or grief, and how. Okay, so this whole notion
Of giving people, of defining grief for other
grief
people.
for them.
Yep.
Yes, and so we see this most poignantly in the protests right now.
Yes.
Where some people, not everybody, have decided that protests are a waste of time. That protests are violent, and all of these other different things. If the protest is peaceful, it's a problem. If there some things get a little bit more agitated, it's a problem. And again, I'm coming back to the point about believe a group of people. Also, think about the notion that if we're seeing these protests continue to happen, take a moment to really think about what's happening here, right?
Yes.
Just trying to be honest and reflective with ourselves about acknowledging what's happening does not mean that you are actually the person who's out there engaging in this behavior. But when we sit silently by, or we try to tell people how to grieve, then each one of those is dangerous, right?
Yes.
It's harmful for people who it's disenfranchising, and it's also suffocating of their grief experience.
Yes.
Two things I want to mention that I like to mention each time is, one, in terms of ally formation with people, and self and other understanding is this. I came up with this concept of culturally conscientious practice, and that is the notion of trying to be open to experience and to evolving knowledge about what's going on, right? So when we let our knowledge evolve, then we're paying attention to patterns over time, right?
Yes.
We can never really look at something as an isolated single event. But when we're able to say, wow, this happened here and it happened there, if this were my family member, how would I feel,
Yes.
right? So keeping those kinds of things in mind, right? And then, evolving knowledge is, we don't have to know everything about every group, but we can learn a great deal by unlearning things that we've learned that when we see contradictions to them through interracial contact, through things we observe in the media. And then the other piece is a lot of marginalized groups deal with suffocated grief. Anybody's vulnerable to it, quite frankly. But suffocated grief is really a parallel concept that I developed that goes along with disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is the idea that people's grief experiences often go unacknowledged in our culture.
Yes.
Right? So people are less likely to acknowledge your loss, especially if it was by homicide or suicide or some non-normative or health-related loss. Suffocated grief is the idea that people tend to penalize. This is where kind of the discrimination piece comes in, or like people at protests are being tear gassed,
Yes.
right? Even at peaceful protests, and underlying that behavior is this basically prejudicial or biased idea that you don't have the right to feel like this. So I want to shut it down, and I'm going to penalize you for it.
Yes.
So I'm not only going to leave your grief unacknowledged, but I'm going to punish you, and that's the suffocated grief piece, for expressing your grief because I don't want to see it, right?
Yes.
I don't think you have the right to it. And so I'm going to shut it down by whatever means necessary. And so we see people's ideas. This is the other dangerous part about our ideas, though, y'all. My listeners, I'm from New Orleans, so I had to go y'all on us. But when we have these ideas, if you pay attention to yourself, if I pay attention to myself, if I have an idea that's biased, it tends to then, the next step is that it tends to play itself out through my behavior.
Yes.
And so
I can create my own validation for my.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so part of, here's the thing, David. One way to maintain power over any group, and particularly today we're talking about bereaved populations, is to try to shatter your reality of what you're experiencing. You know, it's by design.
Yes.
That there's a reason why Black people keep retelling the same story, keep having to go, are going through these same cycles of violence by law enforcement and even in their own communities, and having to continue to retell these stories, is because if somebody paused to listen, if enough people in power paused to listen,
yes,
you know, things would actually change. And again, there's this threat that if this changes, I'm going to lose power. Well, power can be shared, right?
Yes.
And it's less costly when we share power than when some people want to hold on to it or have the illusion that they have more power than they actually do.
Yes. Wow. So talk to me a little bit about this. You know, we're kind of getting to the end of the show. I really want to make sure I ask you this question because I want you to speak to it a bit. I don't want this to just be philosophical, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I always try to end our live with kind of a call to action. What do we do with the things that we've talked about tonight? So let me ask you this way: if you could encourage me, if you could encourage us, but even me, if you could encourage me about one change or one understanding or one practical action, what would that be?
I have to go back to something that I mentioned, and that is, I want to leave you with a few, if I don't mind. They'll be quick. You want one, but I feel like
you give us as much as.
I feel like they're a family of things. One is just greater self-awareness. What am I saying? What am I thinking? I promise you all, as listeners, there's no way I could study grief and loss and be as upbeat as I am, and I'm not always. When I watch these things, I'm human, and they are hard to keep watching people die, right?
Yes.
And to watch the death disparities with COVID, it's really difficult. But one thing that frees me is that when I don't understand something, a good friend of mine mentioned about this whole notion of turning to wonder. Okay, if you don't understand something, before we judge it or decide, to reject it, pause and give it a moment. Like, turn to wonder. I do wonder what it would be like to watch, a pattern of people who are disabled, or a pattern of people who are white, or a pattern of white males be shot down by police.
Yes.
And it be shown on television. There are all of these other things that people are not thinking about. Black bodies are the only ones that we are going to see be publicized like it's slavery in the media, right? They become public deaths, looking like lynchings almost, yes. Right? When anybody has access to watching somebody's family member be shot down like that, and it replay on every channel, and that is exploitative, and it only happens with Black bodies. I can tell you that. You pay attention. So if we're paying attention and we're honest, it's a pattern. So one is turn to wonder. Look at patterns that we're really seeing, right? So notice that these are not one-time events, that a lot of these things are patterns. There are, so conversations with people where we're listening more than we're talking.
Yes.
Right? Don't expect to know it all in one day. That's like trying to eat once and for all. One of my favorite quotes. So knowing that you don't have to know everything, that's impossible. I'm an expert in culture and in Black culture, but things are constantly evolving. There are some patterns though, right?
Yes.
And so when we're listening more than we're talking, we're watching for patterns. We're able to acknowledge a person's grief, even if it's different from our own. The best gift we can give to bereaved people is the gift of listening, of human presence, not
Yes.
advice, not timelines, but the gift of human presence and longevity in our presence, right? So allies, we need you for the long term. So when things start to fizzle, meant to say, sound like Snoop Dogg, when things start to calm down with this shooting, stay with this energy, because it will be here till the next one, right? So a lot of people are trying, more people are trying to understand things right now, but once it's not shown in the media, people then go on with their lives. I'm asking that you hang in there. I'm
Yes.
hanging in there, right? Let's do it together. We all have more to gain that way. Vote.
Mm.
Human presence and trying to understand, but also trying to understand your own lives and your own challenges in ways that you might relate to this whole experience. We all have had experiences of not being believed. And what was that like, right? People who've experienced sexual assault they're so marginalized in this culture. I've written about that too, and the grief around it. So, like all of these different experiences, and if you've been fortunate to not deal with any of these things, then you have even more energy right now to help. That's we need you on the front lines, right? To be that light for populations that are grieving.
And perhaps more responsibility to listen. And,
yes.
And less propensity to have a desire to tell someone what their grief experience should be.
Yeah.
It always is startling to me to move into a group of people that look like me and hear them talk about what the grief experience of Black and Indigenous and people of color should be. And I'm like,
and it's okay. These challenges are great, right? I myself, I have looked up more information on like Indigenous populations, and I've learned a great deal.
Yes.
My final quote that I want to leave you with, since we're talking about listening, is, wisdom is the reward for a lifetime of listening when we would have preferred to talk.
That's funny.
So think about it. We'll be even
I posted that on my Facebook a year ago, and I saw it popped up on my Facebook feed, that exact quote today. That's funny that you would say that.
And then finally, y'all, if you and I've written about this, I'm glad to share this information too. It's 5 A's of culturally conscientious practice, and one of them is, people sometimes don't engage in behaviors because they're afraid that they're going to offend or say the wrong thing. Well, one, if we're listening, it's less likely that those are going to happen.
Yes.
But if we do, apologize.
Yes.
Right? There is so much integrity in that, and so much healing that happens when we do that. So apologize. That's always going to be admired. Well, most likely it will be admired by people around you. We've got this.
So give us the 5 A's. Give us the 5 A's. Now that you've got us,
we want to ask, acknowledge, right? Align. And so part of asking is asking allows us to kind of clarify. Acknowledge allows us to validate. Align allows us to be advocates for people who may not, if somebody may not listen to me speak in the store, but they might listen to my partner who is Jewish, right? But who appears white. So, can you lift the voice up of that person? Apologize. Again, it's humane to make it's human to make an error, but it's humane to apologize, right? To acknowledge our wrongdoings.
Yes.
Wow.
All right.
So thank you, David.
Thank you. So there's a question that came in. I'm going to get you to respond to this quickly if you can. Dr. Bordere, would you say that racism, this is kind of a brain science, would you say that racism is based in the amygdala, in that deep sense of the other and the threat that is experienced?
Well, I'm not a physiological
researcher.
Here's what we know. Here's what I do know as a developmentalist is that it's learned. It's a learned behavior.
Yes.
By the time children are 2 years of age, 2.5 years of age, they have already started to learn gender stereotypes that are valued in our culture. They've started to learn they appreciate racial differences, but they've started to learn that in our culture. I was in Target today, for example, in a toy section, for some things I'm getting for some bereaved kids, and an entire section of this, I could not find one single doll that looked like my children. So it's about, remember, it comes back to access, availability and access, right? So there's a doll somewhere, but there is not one available for my child. So imagine if you went to a store and you never saw things that look like your child, right? We have dolls of all colors in our house, right? But the notion of self-esteem is tied to being able to see positive models and examples of yourselves. It means that you exist, that you are human. Yes. That you count, that you matter. And when you never see images of those things, it's difficult. So when you have that two-year-old who is never seeing positive images, or has fewer opportunities to see positive images of herself or himself, you start to learn what's valuable and what's not valuable. Yes. You start to learn whose life matters and whose life doesn't matter. You start to learn what women should be doing and men should be doing. So it happens very quickly, and you have to really work against it to make sure that children can appreciate. We grew up with this whole socialization of appreciating all the different strengths that come with all of these different backgrounds.
Yes. And it's probably a good time to point out your good friend Jana DeCristofaro is online. She's been posting some great comments. I
saw you left me a message. I'll get in touch with you. I saw you left me a call today.
But Jana's at the Dougie Center. They have some great resources there.
Yes.
On teaching your children about racism. And so Jana, maybe just post the Dougie Center website in the comments for people, and they can go there. And also, if Galen, your question about brain science and whatever, you may want to take a look at Dr. Vanderkolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes.
It's pretty fascinating when you think of 400 years of history and the trauma working its way into the very DNA of the African American community. And now I'm not just carrying my grief. I'm not just carrying my trauma. I'm carrying my grandfathers and great-grandfathers and great-great-grandmothers' trauma, and it's in my body. And the challenge then of working that out, it's not a simple conversation. It's not a one-time conversation. It's a deep conversation.
Yes. That's trauma. That's trauma in the body, and kind of the epigenetic principle, but it's not racism.
No.
So again,
make that connection for us.
I want to make sure that that's very clear. Carrying trauma in your body based on experiences with being dehumanized over 400 years, that we continue to see all of these deaths of the early deaths of Black people who are not getting the health care that they're supposed to get at a doctor's visit, and the way that they're disproportionately died by police violence, excessive energy. Here's the piece I want. So that is carried in your body. That's carried in the weight that is gained. That's carried in obesity issues. It's carried in all of the different ways in which it's manifested in the different survival mechanisms that we see used, right? Yes. So but what I want to say is racism can be unlearned, but it requires work, right? And so I do want to say, there are two concepts. There's accommodation and there's assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is where we just keep taking in more information that we already have, right? So, if somebody has adopted beliefs that are very stereotypical and negative, and demeaning and dehumanizing, we'll just continue to go throughout our lives until we pause and we say, wait, let me stop. Maybe this was what my grandparents thought, maybe this is what my parents thought, but they actually didn't know a single person who was Black or Latino, or right? And so they're basing all of this on just stuff that maybe they got from their grandparent and their socialization, right? So those ideas can be carried until somebody says, hold up, wait, I read something else, or actually I know somebody at work they really defy that. And when I'm watching these patterns happen on TV, they actually make sense. So these things can be unlearned if we pause to do it, but it takes a little bit of work. It's
Yes.
easy for our brains to just say, okay, okay, okay. It takes work for our brains to say, wait a minute, let me accommodate that, because although I knew this, that doesn't fit with what I'm seeing in the media. It doesn't fit with research. It doesn't fit with this friend I have.
Yes.
So it requires a stop, a pause, and a shift, and a conscious shift about being open to knowledge right now, culturally conscientious practice, which I was describing.
Yes.
And it's possible. A lot of people change and shift, and with that comes grief too. Like, oh my God, I've been participating in this. Oh my, right? And so people
Yes.
who are dealing with privilege, when they realize, oh, holy snap, I actually have been participating in this thing and I didn't mean to.
Yes.
There's hope, right? There will be grief around that, and that's fair. And no, and I would say your grief is fair. You're going to experience grief, but here's the next piece: is that what are we going to do with that, right? Or will we just be apathetic and say, oh well, that it is what it is, or will we say, wow, this is really hard for me. I want to do something else. I want to use all of these different, abilities that I have, that, these different privileges or, rights to things that the person next to you might not get to experience like you. How will I use that to raise the voices of people who are speaking, but people are not listening to them?
Yes.
It's like they're invisible. So that's kind of the thing I want to say. It can be unlearned. Accommodation is what has to happen, and it is possible.
Wow. So give us a resource. Give us your resource. Where did your writing on culture, what did you call that again? Culturally
Conscientious practice.
Yes.
I have a book that's co-edited. That's one source. It's called The Handbook of Social Justice Issues
Okay.
in Loss and Bereavement. I want to say it's very reader friendly. It's written really from a really compassionate perspective. I'm an African American female. The other writer is white. I'm a Black female and she's white, and we both kind of write from like our social positionalities, exposing our vulnerabilities as well as coping mechanisms and strengths and challenges in our own journeys. And that book has a number of incredible contributors. There's also, I've done a number of webcasts.
So give us that title again. Give us the title again.
A Handbook of Social Justice Issues and Loss and Grief.
Okay, and people
I've
can
also
find that
written a
on
number of other
people can
articles.
find that on Amazon.
Yes, and it's proudly. I'm glad. That if you want to post something for folks later,
Yes,
I'm glad to do that.
Yeah, I'll put it.
I've
I'll
also
put it
been
in
on Grief
the.
Out Loud, so
Oh, that's exactly right. I'll put it in the. Thank you for putting that up there. Jana just put it up there. The Handbook of Social Justice, co-edited with Darcy Harris.
Yes.
So you can go on to Amazon and find that, or if you have a local Black-owned
Library.
bookshop, then you should go buy it there instead. Yeah. I just am so incredibly thankful for your generosity of spirit and generosity of time, Tashel. I feel like we could. I feel like we could talk for many more hours. I hope you'll come back and continue this conversation. My heart is, very tender and very hopeful. And I just feel like you've spoken some tremendously helpful things, and I am extraordinarily thankful. Thank you.
Yes, and so am I. And thank you to the listeners who follow David and a number of these other programs. So thank you for listening and for your courage in asking questions and showing up. This also demonstrates that you're already open to evolving knowledge.
Yes.
So thank you for keeping me going as well.
There you go. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. Thank you for everybody that showed up today. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for everyone that will watch this and grapple with the ideas that are here. Don't be afraid to grow. Just don't be afraid to grow. So, all right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.
All right. even after this live is over, you can still leave comments or questions. I'll be coming back to review the comments and interact with them, and I'll make sure that Dr. Bordere gets them as well. Don't forget to click on notifications so that you can get a reminder of whenever it is that we're going live. And please feel free to share this live on all of your social media platforms. This is incredible conversation, and you can also find these conversations archived on the Grief and Grace page on YouTube. So if you know someone that you feel like, oh, I wish that they would have been able to hear this tonight, just go to YouTube, put in Grief and Grace, you'll find it there. So, all right, thank you. We've gone a little longer than we normally do, but it was incredible and important, and I'm so thankful that you were here with us tonight. All right, stay safe, everybody.